I never thought a tiny creek running through my backyard would become the center of a legal war. But when I saw construction equipment on my property at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, I knew my quiet life in rural Montana was about to get a whole lot more complicated. My name is Robert Sanders, and I had moved to the small town of Livingston, Montana, about 3 years prior. I was a software engineer who worked remotely, which meant I could live anywhere with decent internet. I had chosen this particular property specifically because it had a beautiful natural creek running through it. The water came from the mountains, wound through my 5 acres, and continued downstream to several other properties in what was loosely called a neighborhood, though the houses were spread far apart. The creek was about 15 feet wide at its broadest point on my land, maybe 2 feet deep in most places. It was full of trout, and I spent many peaceful evenings sitting by the water with a beer, watching the sun set over the mountains. The sound of running water was therapeutic after long days staring at computer screens. That morning, though, the sound of diesel engines replaced the peaceful babbling of the creek. I threw on jeans and a jacket and stormed outside. There were 2 excavators and a dump truck parked near the creek about 50 feet from my property line. A group of 5 people stood near the equipment, looking at what appeared to be blueprints. I recognized one of them immediately, and my stomach sank. Patricia Brennan, the president of the Paradise Valley Estates Homeowners Association. Now, I need to explain something about Paradise Valley Estates. When I bought my property, the HOA barely existed. It was one of those things that was technically on paper, but never enforced. There were maybe 30 homes spread across several square miles of rural Montana land, and most people kept to themselves. The HOA had been dormant for years. Then, Patricia moved in about 18 months ago. She was a woman in her mid-50s with short blonde hair that always looked freshly styled, even at 7 in the morning. She wore expensive athletic wear that had clearly never seen actual athletic activity. Within 2 months of moving in, she had somehow convinced enough neighbors to revive the HOA and elect her president. Most people had ignored the election, which meant Patricia and her small group of supporters essentially took control by default. I had ignored the HOA completely. My property had been here before the HOA was even a concept, and I was grandfathered out of most of the regulations. Or so I thought. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted as I approached the group. Patricia turned to me with that smile she always wore. It was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the kind that salespeople use when they are trying to sell you something you absolutely do not want. "Robert, good morning. I was hoping we could catch you before we started." "Started what? That equipment is on my property." "Actually," she pulled out a document from a leather folder she was holding. "According to the county survey we had done, this section of the creek is right at the property line. We will be working just on the HOA common area side." "There is no HOA common area here. This is all private property." "That is where you are wrong." She handed me the document. 3 years ago, when the original developer created this subdivision, a strip of land along the creek was designated as common area for all homeowners to enjoy. It is in your deed, though I understand if you missed it. I stared at the document. I would need to verify this with my lawyer, but it looked official. A strip about 30 feet wide along the creek on the opposite side from my house was highlighted. "Okay, fine, but what are you building?" Patricia's smile widened. "The HOA board has approved a wonderful community improvement project. We are going to create a small pond for ice skating in the winter and recreation in the summer. It will add value to everyone's property. By damming the creek, it is a small, tasteful dam. The water will still flow, just more slowly. The pond will be about 200 feet long and quite beautiful. I felt my blood pressure rising. That creek supplies water to at least a dozen properties downstream, including mine. You cannot just dam it. We have consulted with engineers, Robert. Everything is legal and proper. The water will still flow through. There will just be a lovely pond as well. I want to see the permits. She pulled out more documents. Montana Department of Environmental Quality permit. Army Corps of Engineers permit for work affecting a waterway. County building permit. Everything looked legitimate. The HOA board approved this project 3 months ago. We sent notice to all homeowners. I never got any notice. We sent it to the address on file. Perhaps you should update your information with the HOA. That smile again. I realized what had happened. The HOA probably had my old address from when I first bought the property. I had used my parents' address in Billings for the initial paperwork and only updated the county records later. If Patricia had access to the old HOA records, she would have sent the notice to the wrong address, and she probably knew it. This is going to affect the water flow on my property. I have rights as a riparian landowner, and those rights are being respected. The engineers have assured us that the dam will not significantly impact downstream water flow. Everything is legal, Robert. Now, if you will excuse us, we have work to do. She turned her back to me and started directing the equipment operators. I stood there, furious and helpless. I could call my lawyer, but if they really had all the permits, there might not be much I could do immediately. I went back to my house and immediately started making phone calls. My lawyer, Tom Chen, was a good attorney in Bozeman who had helped me with the property purchase. He agreed to look into it but warned me that if they had proper permits, stopping them would be difficult. HOAs in Montana have a lot of power if they follow the proper procedures, he explained. And if the common area designation is in the original plat, she is right about that. Can they just dam a creek without considering the impact on other landowners? If they got the permits, it means someone at the state level approved it. But let me dig into this. Give me a few days. I spent those few days watching the construction from my kitchen window. The excavators dug out a basin about 200 feet long and maybe 100 feet wide. They installed a small concrete dam with a control gate. It was actually well constructed, which frustrated me more. If they had done a sloppy job, I might have grounds to complain about safety or environmental damage. The creek began to back up behind the dam, forming the pond Patricia wanted. The water level dropped noticeably on my section of the creek. What had been a cheerful, babbling stream became a sluggish trickle. The deeper pools where trout used to hang out became shallow depressions. The sound that had made this property so peaceful was reduced to a whisper. Tom called me back 4 days later with bad news. They dotted every I and crossed every T, he said. The permits are valid. The environmental assessment claimed minimal impact on downstream flow, and technically, they are not stopping the water, just slowing it down. The common area designation is legitimate. It was part of the original 1987 subdivision plat, and because it is an HOA project for community benefit, they have pretty broad authority. So I have no recourse. I did not say that. But stopping them now would require proving that the actual impact is worse than what was assessed in the permits. You would need your own hydrological study, and that takes time and money. We are talking months and tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. And in the meantime, my creek is destroyed. I am sorry, Robert. Sometimes the law protects the wrong people. I hung up feeling defeated. That evening, I walked down to what was left of my creek. The water barely moved. Already, algae was starting to form on the rocks that used to be washed clean by the current. The whole character of the stream had changed. Upstream, I could see Patricia and a few other HOA board members standing by their new pond, taking pictures. They had brought champagne. They were celebrating. I went back to my house and tried to work, but I could not focus. Every time I looked out the window, I saw that stagnant trickle where my beautiful creek used to be. I thought about selling and moving, but that felt like letting Patricia win. Plus, property values for a house with a dying creek were not great. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the problem from every angle. Patricia had outmaneuvered me legally. She had done her homework, gotten her permits, followed the rules. She had turned my creek into her skating pond, and there was nothing I could do about it. Or was there? Around 2 in the morning, an idea started forming. I got up and pulled out the survey maps of my property that I had from the purchase. I spread them on my kitchen table and studied them carefully. The creek entered my property at the northwest corner, flowing in from Bureau of Land Management territory in the mountains. It wound through my land for about half a mile before reaching the property line where Patricia had built her dam. The survey showed every detail of my 5 acres, and that is when I saw it. The creek on my property was entirely within my boundaries. It did not touch the common area until it reached the property line, which meant the water flowing through my land was under my control as a riparian landowner. I could not stop the natural flow. That would be illegal, but I could potentially alter how that water moved through my property. I spent the rest of the night researching Montana water law. By morning, I had a plan. It was risky and it might not work, but I was angry enough to try. Over the next few days, I made careful observations. I walked my entire property, following the creek from where it entered to where it left. About 100 yards before my property line, there was a natural low area to the east, a kind of depression where water probably used to flow centuries ago before the creek carved its current path. If I could redirect the creek into that depression, it would flow through a different part of my property and exit onto a completely different neighbor's land. The neighbor to my east was Frank Morrison, a retired rancher who lived alone on a large property. I had met him a few times. He was a good guy, quiet and independent. He had no love for Patricia's HOA either. He had been one of the few people who actively voted against reviving it. I walked over to Frank's property one afternoon. His house was a weathered ranch style with a barn and several outbuildings. He was working on a tractor when I arrived. "Robert," he greeted me, wiping grease from his hands. "What brings you over? I need to ask you about something. Did the HOA's pond project affect your water at all?" Frank spat on the ground. "That woman." "Yeah, the little spring on the north part of my property slowed down. It feeds off the same aquifer as the creek, I think. Not enough to cause problems for me, but I noticed." "What would you think if the creek flowed through your property instead?" He raised an eyebrow. "You are thinking of rerouting it, maybe. There is a natural drainage path through the east side of my land that would bring it to your property line. If I could direct the water that way, it would bypass Patricia's dam entirely." Frank thought about this, then started grinning. "And leave her precious pond dry. That is the idea. Is it legal? That is the tricky part. I have been reading Montana water law. As a riparian landowner, I have rights to the water flowing through my property. I cannot stop it or consume it all, but I can make reasonable use of it and make reasonable changes to my land. The question is whether rerouting the creek counts as reasonable." "Seems reasonable to me," Frank said. "And hell, I would not mind having a creek running through my land. Water is always useful. So if I redirect it to your property line, you would be okay with it continuing through your land?" "More than okay. That northeast section of mine is pretty dry. Creek water would be good for it, and anything that pisses off Patricia Brennan is fine by me." We shook on it. I spent the next week preparing. I researched exactly how to divert a small stream. I watched YouTube videos on creek restoration and water management. I ordered several loads of large rocks and had them delivered to my property. I rented a small excavator. I also consulted with Tom, my lawyer, about the legality. It is a gray area, he admitted. You have riparian rights, but so do downstream landowners, including the HOA common area. If you significantly alter the flow, they could sue you. But if the water ends up in the same watershed, just through a different route, then it gets interesting. The water would still be going downstream, just not through the HOA's dam. They might have a case that they have an established right to the water flow based on their permits and investment. But you would have a case that you are simply managing the water on your own property, so it could go either way. It would probably end up in court. But Robert, if you are thinking of doing this, document everything. Take photos, keep records. Make sure you can show that you are not trying to harm anyone, just managing your own property. That was good enough for me. I started work on a Saturday morning. The excavator rental was supposed to be for the weekend, and I wanted to finish as quickly as possible. I began at the natural depression I had identified, using the excavator to deepen and widen it into a channel. I worked carefully, trying to make it look as natural as possible, like I was just enhancing an existing drainage path. The work was harder than I expected. Even a small excavator is complicated to operate, and I had only watched some tutorial videos. I made mistakes, had to redo sections, and took far longer than planned. By Saturday evening, I had created a channel from the depression to my eastern property line, but I had not yet connected it to the creek. Sunday morning, I started early. This was the critical part. I needed to create a new path that would direct the creek water into my diversion channel. I could not just dam up the existing creek. That would be obviously illegal. Instead, I needed to make the new path more attractive to the water than the old path. I used rocks and earth to create a series of small barriers in the existing creek bed, not blocking it entirely but making it more difficult for water to flow that way. At the same time, I dug a smooth, wide entrance to my new channel. Water, like everything else in nature, follows the path of least resistance. By Sunday afternoon, the work was done. I stood at the point where the creek split and watched. For a few minutes, water continued flowing both ways. Then, gradually, more and more water chose the new channel. Within an hour, the new path was carrying most of the flow, and the old creek bed was down to a trickle. I followed the water through my property. It flowed through the channel I had created, exiting onto Frank's land. I walked over to his property and found him watching the water arrive. "Well, I will be damned," he said. "You actually did it. Now we see if Patricia notices." We did not have to wait long. Monday morning, I woke to the sound of someone pounding on my door. I looked at the clock. It was 6:30 in the morning. I pulled on clothes and opened the door to find Patricia standing there, her face red with fury. "What did you do?" she screamed. "Good morning, Patricia. Can I help you?" "The pond, the water. You sabotaged the HOA project. I have no idea what you are talking about." "The creek is not flowing into the pond anymore. It is completely dry." I kept my face neutral. "That is strange. Maybe there is a drought. Do not play games with me. I know you did something. You redirected the creek." "I did some landscaping on my property over the weekend. Improved drainage, moved some rocks around, all on my own land." "You cannot do that. That water is supposed to flow through the HOA common area." "Actually, Patricia, the water on my property is under my management as a riparian landowner. I have rights to make reasonable improvements to my land. The water is still flowing downstream, just through a different path. We built a pond. We have permits. You have permits to dam the water that flows to you, but if the water does not flow to you anymore, that is not my problem." She looked like she might explode. This is illegal. I am calling the police. I am calling my lawyer." "You do that. And while you are at it, maybe check whether your permits actually gave you any right to the water on my property." She stormed off, pulling out her phone. I closed the door and allowed myself a small smile. I knew this was just the beginning, but for now I enjoyed the victory. Within 2 hours, a sheriff's deputy showed up. Deputy Martinez was a young guy, probably late 20s, and he looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Sanders, I got a call about a property dispute. Mind if I take a look around?" "Not at all, Deputy. Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you, sir. The complaint is that you illegally diverted a creek." "I did some landscaping on my property. Improved drainage. The creek naturally found a new path. We walked down to where I had done the work." I showed him the channel, explained that it was all on my property, showed him the property markers. "Did you block the original creek?" he asked. "Nope. Water can still flow that way if it wants to. I just made another path more attractive. The water chose where to go." He took some notes, looked around, then shrugged. "This seems like a civil matter, sir. If the HOA thinks you violated some agreement or law, they will have to take it up in court. There is no criminal activity I can see." Patricia was waiting by the patrol car when we returned. "Well, are you going to arrest him?" "Madam, this is a civil dispute. You will need to contact your lawyer." "Civil dispute? He destroyed HOA property." "He did landscaping on his own property, madam. The water went where water goes. That is not a police matter." She argued for another 5 minutes, but Deputy Martinez held firm. Eventually she left and he turned to me. "Heads up, Mr. Sanders. She is really angry. This probably is not over." "I know. Thanks for being fair about it." He nodded and left. I went back inside and called Tom. "She already called me," he said. "Well, her lawyer did. They are threatening to sue for an injunction to force you to restore the creek." "Can they do that?" "They can try. We will need to argue that you have riparian rights and that your improvements to your property were reasonable." The good news is that injunctions are hard to get. They will need to show immediate irreparable harm. Their pond is dry. Is not that harm? It is harm to an artificial structure they built. That is different from harm to natural water rights. Plus, the water is still flowing downstream, just through Frank Morrison's property now instead of theirs. The overall watershed has not changed. So what happens next? They will probably file a lawsuit. It will take months to get to court. In the meantime, the creek stays where it is unless they can get an emergency injunction, which I doubt they will. He was right. 2 days later, I was served with a lawsuit. The Paradise Valley Estates, HOA, was suing me for $500,000 in damages and demanding that I restore the creek to its original path. The complaint was full of angry language about willful destruction of property and violation of water rights. Tom and I filed a response denying everything and asserting my riparian rights. We argued that I had simply made improvements to my property and that the water had naturally chosen a new path. We filed a counterclaim against the HOA for diminishing my property value by damming the creek in the first place. The legal battle dragged on for months. There were depositions where Patricia sat across from me and glared while her lawyer asked questions about my exact actions that weekend. There were expert witnesses, hydrologists who studied the watershed and testified about water flow. The HOA's expert said I had illegally diverted the stream. My expert said I had simply enhanced natural drainage patterns. During all this, Patricia made my life as difficult as possible. Suddenly, the HOA started enforcing every tiny rule. My grass was too long, violation, fine. I had a truck parked in my driveway for more than 24 hours, violation, fine. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black, violation, fine. I fought every single one. Tom sent letters pointing out that my property was grandfathered from most HOA rules, but it was exhausting and expensive. The worst part was at the HOA board meetings. Montana law required HOA meetings to be open to all homeowners, so I started attending. Patricia used them as a platform to attack me publicly. She showed pictures of the vandalized creek bed. She talked about how my selfish actions had destroyed a community amenity. She painted me as the villain. Most of the neighbors did not care. They had never used the pond and probably never would have. But Patricia had a few loyal supporters, mostly other middle-aged women who had moved to Montana from somewhere else and wanted to turn rural Paradise Valley into a suburban homeowner's paradise. One of them, Deborah Hutchins, actually confronted me at the local grocery store in Livingston. "You should be ashamed," she said, blocking my way in the produce aisle. "That pond was for everyone to enjoy. You destroyed it because of your selfishness." "The pond destroyed my creek," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I just fixed my property." "You are a liar and a vandal. Patricia says you probably broke all sorts of laws." "Then Patricia can prove it in court. Now excuse me, I need to buy tomatoes." She huffed and moved aside, but I could feel her glaring at me as I finished shopping. The case finally went before a judge 10 months after I had diverted the creek. It was early March, still cold in Montana. We met at the Park County Courthouse in Livingston. Judge Helen Morrison, no relation to Frank, was a stern woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. The HOA's lawyer, a slick guy from Bozeman named Richard Walsh, presented their case first. He talked about the money the HOA had invested in the pond, over $80,000. He showed pictures of the beautiful pond when it was full. He called it a community asset that benefited all homeowners. Then he showed pictures of the pond now. It was a muddy depression with some puddles and a concrete dam going nowhere. It looked terrible. "Your Honor," Walsh said dramatically, "Mr. Sanders took the law into his own hands and destroyed this community project out of spite. He illegally diverted a waterway, violating Montana water law and the HOA's legitimate rights. We ask that the court order him to restore the creek to its natural path and award damages for the destruction he caused." Then it was Tom's turn. He was calmer, more methodical. "Your Honor, Mr. Sanders is a riparian landowner with clear rights to the water flowing through his property. The HOA built their pond without any guaranteed right to the water. They assumed the creek would continue flowing through the common area, but they did not own the water. When Mr. Sanders made legitimate improvements to his property, the water naturally chose a new path. That is not illegal diversion. That is nature taking its course." He presented our own photos, showing how the creek had diminished on my property after the HOA's dam. He showed documentation of the erosion and environmental damage their pond had caused upstream. He called Frank Morrison as a witness. Frank testified that the creek flowing through his property had been beneficial. He was using it for irrigation and livestock water. He had riparian rights now too, and those rights were just as valid as anyone else's. The judge asked tough questions of both sides. She wanted to know exactly what I had done that weekend. She wanted to see the permits the HOA had obtained. She asked about Montana water law and riparian rights. Finally, she took a recess to consider. Tom and I waited in the hallway. Patricia and her lawyer waited at the other end. She kept glaring at me. After 2 hours, we were called back in. "This is a complicated case," Judge Morrison began. On one hand, the HOA made a substantial investment in good faith, obtaining proper permits and following procedure. On the other hand, those permits did not grant them ownership of the water itself, only the right to dam what flowed to them. Mr. Sanders, as a riparian landowner, has rights to the water on his property. The question is whether his actions violated those competing interests. She paused, and I held my breath. After reviewing the evidence and the law, I find that Mr. Sanders acted within his rights as a riparian landowner. Montana water law is clear that riparian owners can make reasonable use of water flowing through their property, including making changes to improve drainage and manage their land. Mr. Sanders did not dam the creek or stop it entirely. He created an alternative path, and the water naturally flowed that way. The fact that this path bypasses the HOA's pond is unfortunate for the HOA, but it does not make Mr. Sanders' actions illegal. Patricia gasped audibly. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm. However, the judge continued, I also find that the HOA acted in good faith based on the permits they obtained. They reasonably believed they had the right to build their pond. This is a case where both parties believed they were acting correctly, and the law is ambiguous enough that both had reasonable arguments. Therefore, I am ruling that Mr. Sanders does not have to restore the creek, but he is also not entitled to damages from the HOA. Each party will bear their own legal costs. The creek will remain in its new path unless some future negotiation between the parties results in a different arrangement. The gavel came down. It was not a complete victory, since I had to pay my own legal fees, which had reached nearly $30,000 by this point. But I had won the important part. I did not have to change the creek back. Walsh immediately stood. Your Honor, we request an appeal. That is your right, Counselor. But the creek stays where it is pending any appeal. As we left the courtroom, Patricia looked absolutely murderous. This is not over, she hissed as we passed in the hallway. I will make sure you regret this. That was a mistake on her part. Threatening language in a courthouse with witnesses around is never a good idea. Over the next few weeks, the harassment from the HOA intensified. I received violation notices almost daily. My fence was 6 inches too tall. My shed was the wrong color. I had parked my car facing the wrong direction. Every single complaint was petty and clearly retaliatory. Then things got worse. Someone filed an anonymous complaint with the county claiming I had built structures without permits. That triggered an inspection of my property. The inspector found that my creek diversion work, while on my own property, had altered a waterway without a permit from Montana DEQ. I was fined $5,000 and ordered to either obtain a retroactive permit or restore the creek. Tom was furious. This is absolutely Patricia's doing. She probably researched until she found some regulation you technically violated. Can we fight it? Yes, but it will take time, and the fine stands until you either pay it or successfully appeal it. I paid the fine. It hurt, but I did not want to give them any leverage. Then I applied for the retroactive permit. The application required a new environmental study, more engineering reports, more money down the drain. While waiting for the permit process, I noticed strange things happening. Someone spray-painted graffiti on my mailbox. Someone dumped trash at the end of my driveway. My internet service got mysteriously disconnected 3 times, and each time the service provider said someone had called to cancel it, claiming to be me. I installed security cameras. Within a week, they caught Deborah Hutchins, Patricia's friend, creeping onto my property at night and pulling up flowers from my garden. The cameras had excellent night vision and her face was clearly visible. I called the sheriff's office. Deputy Martinez came out again. "That is definitely her," he said, watching the footage. "That is trespassing and vandalism. Do you want to press charges?" "Absolutely." Deborah was arrested the next day. She cried and claimed she was just trying to help by removing invasive plants, which was obviously a lie since she had pulled up domestic roses. She got a citation and a fine, plus a restraining order requiring her to stay away from my property. Patricia must have realized things were escalating dangerously because the harassment stopped for a while, but I could tell she was planning something. She had that look at HOA meetings, like a predator watching prey. The next attack came from an unexpected direction. I received a letter from the Montana Department of Revenue claiming I owed back taxes on my property. According to their records, my property included the former common area where Patricia's pond sat, and I had not been paying taxes on it. This was absurd. I called the county assessor's office and eventually untangled the mess. Someone, I suspected Patricia, had submitted forged documents claiming that the common area had been deeded to me. This would have made me responsible for taxes on it and also potentially liable for the pond construction as the landowner. It took 6 weeks to straighten out. The county investigated and determined the documents were fraudulent. I asked them to find out who submitted them, but they claimed that information was not available. The documents had been mailed anonymously, but I knew. And I decided it was time to stop playing defense and go on offense. I hired a private investigator named Sarah Kendrick. She was an ex-cop from Billings who specialized in civil cases. I asked her to dig into Patricia's background and her involvement with the HOA. What she found was explosive. Patricia had moved to Montana from California about 2 years prior. Before that, she had been involved in 2 other HOAs, one in Orange County and one in Sacramento. In both cases, she had been on the board. And in both cases, there had been financial irregularities. In Orange County, nearly $50,000 in HOA funds had gone missing during her tenure as treasurer. The case had been settled quietly, with Patricia resigning and the HOA recovering some of the money through her homeowners insurance. No criminal charges were filed. In Sacramento, she had been sued by the HOA after she left for approving inflated contracts to a landscaping company owned by her brother. Again, the case settled out of court, but here was the interesting part. In Montana, Patricia was not just HOA president, she was also treasurer. And Sarah found something odd in the financial records that were publicly available through the HOA's required disclosures. The pond project had cost $80,000 according to the lawsuit, but the HOA's funds had been depleted by nearly $120,000 over the same period. Where had the extra $40,000 gone? Sarah dug deeper. She contacted the contractors who had worked on the pond and got copies of their actual invoices. The excavation work had cost $35,000, not $50,000 as claimed in the HOA records. The concrete work was $20,000, not $30,000. Almost every line item was inflated in the HOA's books compared to the actual costs. Someone had been pocketing the difference. Tom and I met with Sarah to review her findings. "This is embezzlement," Tom said flatly. "Patricia has been stealing from the HOA. Can we prove it?" I asked. "With these documents, yes. The question is what you want to do about it." I thought about it. I could take this to the HOA board, but Patricia controlled the board. Her supporters would probably defend her or claim the documents were fake. I could take it to the police, but financial crimes were hard to prosecute and it might take years, or I could use it as leverage. "Let me think about this," I said. That night, I composed an email. I attached Sarah's full report, including all the financial documents and contractor statements. I explained clearly that Patricia had embezzled approximately $40,000 from the HOA. I laid out the evidence point by point. Then I sent it to every single homeowner in Paradise Valley Estates. Every email address I could find, about 30 families. The response was immediate. My phone started ringing. People were angry, not at me but at Patricia. Many of them had paid special assessments to fund the pond project. Learning that their money had been stolen was infuriating. An emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Saturday. I attended, along with nearly every other homeowner, which was unprecedented. Usually, only Patricia and her few supporters showed up. Patricia tried to maintain control, but the crowd was hostile. People demanded explanations for the financial discrepancies. They wanted to see the original invoices. They wanted an independent audit. Patricia claimed that I had fabricated the documents, that this was revenge for the pond dispute. But several homeowners had already contacted the contractors independently and confirmed the actual costs. "You are a liar and a thief," shouted Mike Thompson, a retired banker who lived 3 properties down from me. "I want my money back," others joined in. The meeting devolved into chaos. Patricia tried to adjourn the meeting, but someone called for a vote to remove her from the board. By Montana HOA law, that was allowed with a sufficient majority. The vote was nearly unanimous. Patricia, Deborah, and one other supporter voted no. Everyone else voted yes. Patricia was removed as HOA president and treasurer, effective immediately. The board appointed Mike Thompson as interim president. His first act was to call the sheriff's office and file a formal complaint for embezzlement. Detective Sarah Williams from the Park County Sheriff's Office took on the case. With the evidence Sarah Kendrick had gathered, plus the HOA's official complaint, there was enough to get a warrant. Patricia's home was searched, and they found records showing that she had been writing HOA checks to herself for consulting fees and project management that had never been approved by the board. Patricia was arrested in early May, about 18 months after I had first seen construction equipment on my property. She was charged with felony theft and embezzlement. The amount was over $40,000, which made it a serious crime in Montana. The case went to criminal court in September. Patricia pleaded no contest in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, sentenced to 2 years in prison with 18 months suspended, and given 3 years of probation. She also had to perform 500 hours of community service. Her husband, a quiet man named George who I had barely ever seen, divorced her and moved back to California. Their house went up for sale. With Patricia gone, the HOA underwent major changes. Mike Thompson and the new board reviewed all the rules and scaled back the enforcement dramatically. Most of the petty regulations were removed. The HOA returned to what it had been originally, a minimal organization that just handled the few common areas and kept the roads maintained. One of the first things they did was officially abandon the pond project. The dry basin and concrete dam were demolished, and the area was returned to natural state. Several board members approached me and Frank Morrison about possibly allowing the creek to return to its original path in exchange for the HOA paying for the restoration work and guaranteeing no future interference with the water. Frank and I discussed it. The creek flowing through his property had actually been beneficial to him, but he was open to either option. I thought about it carefully. The creek's original path had been beautiful, and I missed having it close to my house. "I will agree on one condition," I told Mike. "The creek stays natural. No dams, no ponds, no structures. just a natural stream. Absolutely, Mike agreed. We learned our lesson. The HOA will never touch that creek again. They hired an environmental restoration company out of Bozeman. The workers carefully removed my diversion channel, filling it in and replanting native vegetation. They removed the barriers I had placed in the original creek bed. Within a few weeks, the water was flowing naturally again through my property, just as it had before Patricia's pond. The stream came back to life quickly. The algae died off. The trout returned. The sound of running water filled my backyard again. It was like healing after a long illness. Frank's property kept some water flow too. The restoration company had created a small natural split in the creek upstream, allowing some water to flow through the channel on my east side before rejoining the main stream on Frank's land. He got a year-round irrigation source, and the watershed was healthier with the distributed flow. As for the legal costs, I never recovered those directly. But the HOA, under new management, made a goodwill payment to both Frank and me, compensating us for our trouble and thanking us for working with them on the restoration. It was not the full $30,000 I had spent on lawyers, but it was enough to take the sting out. Patricia served her 4 months of actual jail time in the Montana Women's Prison in Billings. After her release, she left Montana entirely. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to Arizona, though I never confirmed it and did not care enough to find out. Deborah Hutchins, Patricia's main supporter, also moved away. The shame of being convicted for trespassing and vandalism, plus the association with Patricia's crimes, was too much for her. Several other Patricia supporters just kept their heads down and stopped attending HOA meetings. The Paradise Valley Estates HOA continued in its reformed state. Mike Thompson served as president for 2 years before handing off to another neighbor. The HOA became what it should have been from the start, a simple organization that maintained roads, organized an occasional neighborhood barbecue, and otherwise left people alone. My life returned to normal. I worked from home, enjoyed my restored creek, and occasionally went fishing in my own backyard. The whole ordeal had cost me probably $40,000 between legal fees, the state fine, excavator rental, and other expenses. But I had my peace back, and that was worth every penny. I learned some important lessons through the experience. First, HOAs can be dangerous when the wrong people take control. Second, knowing your legal rights is crucial, especially property and water rights. Third, documentation is everything. My security cameras, photos of the creek at various stages, and financial records had been essential to defending myself and eventually exposing Patricia's crimes. But the most important lesson was simpler. Sometimes you have to fight back. When someone tries to bully you, whether through legal maneuvering or petty harassment, standing your ground is essential. I could have given up after Patricia dammed my creek. I could have sold my house and moved. Instead, I fought back in creative and legal ways, and eventually, the truth came out. About a year after everything settled, I was sitting by the creek one evening with a beer, watching the sunset. Frank walked over, something he did occasionally now that we had become friends through the whole ordeal. "Beautiful evening," he said, settling onto a rock next to me. "Sure is. You ever regret buying this place? With all the trouble it caused," I thought about it, the stress, the money, the time, the anger. Patricia's face when she pounded on my door. The months of legal battles, watching my creek reduced to a trickle, all of it. "No," I said, "this is home. And nobody was going to take that away from me." Frank nodded. "I heard the new family that bought Patricia's old house seems nice. Young couple, 2 kids. They asked me if the neighborhood was friendly. What did you tell them?" Told them it is very friendly as long as you are not trying to dam anyone's creek. We both laughed. The sound mixed with the babbling of the water, the rustle of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. Life in Paradise Valley had returned to paradise. The whole experience changed how I thought about property ownership and community. Before Patricia, I had been somewhat naive. I thought that owning property meant it was truly yours and that neighborhoods were naturally harmonious. I learned that property rights are complex, that water rights even more so, and that communities can be weaponized by determined individuals. But I also learned that most people are reasonable. Once Patricia was exposed, the majority of neighbors were embarrassed by what had happened and wanted to make things right. They had not supported her crimes, they had just been passive and uninformed. When presented with the truth, they did the right thing. The creek still runs through my property today. On quiet evenings, I sit outside and listen to it, grateful for the sound. Sometimes I think about that morning when I saw the construction equipment, the moment this whole story began. I remember the anger and the helplessness I felt. But I also remember the satisfaction when the water first flowed through my diversion channel. The moment I realized I did not have to be helpless. The day the judge ruled in my favor. The meeting where Patricia was removed from power. The arrest that brought justice. And I remember the final day when the restoration company finished their work and the creek flowed naturally again, the way it had for thousands of years before any of us built houses here. That was the real victory, not beating Patricia, but restoring what had been damaged. I still get occasional letters from the HOA, but now they are reasonable things like please remember to trim trees near the shared road or annual HOA picnic this Saturday. The organization serves the community instead of ruling over it. That is how it should be. My property value recovered and then increased. A house with a beautiful creek is worth more than one with a stagnant trickle. The real estate agent who sold Patricia's old house told me that my property was now one of the most desirable in Paradise Valley estates. Funny how things work out. I kept in touch with Tom Chen, my lawyer. He told me the case became something of a legend in Montana property law circles, an example of riparian rights and HOA overreach. Law students at the University of Montana apparently study it. I am not sure how I feel about being a case study, but if it helps someone else defend their property rights, I suppose it is worthwhile. Sarah Kendrick, the private investigator, sent me a Christmas card that first year. She had moved on to other cases, but she told me mine had been one of her favorites. Not often I get to catch someone red-handed like that, she wrote. Keep fighting the good fight. Deputy Martinez, who had responded to Patricia's initial call when she discovered the diverted creek, stopped by one day months later. He was checking on an unrelated issue in the neighborhood and took a moment to visit. I wanted to tell you, he said. That case taught me something. When I first got that call, I thought it was just angry neighbors fighting over nothing. But it turned out to be embezzlement and harassment and all kinds of serious issues. Made me realize that HOA disputes can be more complicated than they look. Did it change how you handle those calls? Yeah. Now I pay more attention, and I tell people to document everything like you did with those security cameras. Your footage of that Hutchins woman trespassing made the case solid. Without it, it would have been he said, she said. I appreciated that. One positive outcome of the whole mess was that local law enforcement took HOA abuse more seriously. The seasons changed in Paradise Valley. Summer brought hot days and cool nights. I would sit by the creek with my laptop, working remotely while surrounded by nature. Fall painted the mountains in gold and red. Winter brought snow and cold, and the creek would partially freeze, creating beautiful ice formations. Spring melted everything and brought floods of fresh, clear water from the mountains. Through it all, the creek flowed steadily, indifferent to the human drama that had once surrounded it. Water does not care about property lines or HOA regulations or legal battles. It just flows downhill, following the path of least resistance, the way it has for millions of years. Sometimes I think about Patricia and wonder what she is doing now. Is she involved in another HOA somewhere, causing more trouble? Did she learn anything from being caught and punished? I will never know, and I suppose it does not matter. She is gone from my life, a closed chapter. What matters is that I protected my home. I stood up to someone who tried to bully me with regulations and legal technicalities. I fought back creatively and ultimately exposed corruption that needed to be revealed. And in the end, I restored what had been damaged. That is the story of how the HOA dammed my river to build a skating pond, and how I diverted the water and left them dry. It is a story about property rights and water law, about HOA overreach and embezzlement, about standing your ground and fighting for what is right. But mostly, it is a story about a creek in Montana and the lengths one man went to protect it. The water still flows. The trout still swim. The sound still soothes. And I am still here, living in my home by the creek, exactly where I belong. That is victory enough.